That's a roundabout way of saying I'm McKane Andrus, and I'll be presenting on some of the work that inspired us to organize this workshop. And yeah, just kind of go into a bit more detail on what we hope to cover today. And so, as Sarah mentioned, right, and as most of you probably know, most algorithmic fairness and bias auditing techniques do require some kind of sensitive category variable to make these comparisons across groups. But as Sarah mentioned, and as we discuss in our presentation at the general conference on our work, this requirement does pose a threat to the usability of algorithmic fairness in practice. And so today we're going to be using this term demographic data to refer to data about sensitive category membership. So this includes protected classes, special categories, as well as less regulated classes, such as socioeconomic status, and kind of just anything used to do these kind of group disaggregations for fairness analyses. And so when we started this work, we had these questions around what actually happens when a machine learning practitioner kind of wants to use demographic data to assess bias or unfairness in the system. And so prior work had shown that, generally speaking, a lot of these kind of sensitive category attributes are not available in practice. But with our work, we wanted to figure out like what factors cause the most difficulty for practitioners in this space, and do those difficulties seem surmountable or resolvable? And so just to briefly recap some of our findings from this study, we encountered two main sources of difficulty around attempts to collect or use demographic data. And so some barriers came in the form of organizational constraints, while others cropped up more on the practitioner side of things. And so in terms of the organizational constraints, perhaps unsurprisingly, privacy law and policies often do make collecting demographic data kind of a non-starter, especially in contexts where GDPR applies, or where there is a norm of kind of collecting only what data is explicitly needed. And on the flip side of that, anti-discrimination law can sometimes actually explicitly require the collection of demographic data to monitor discriminatory impacts. But most often, from what we saw, especially in the US, the law is just not clear for most industries on this front. And so what actually happens is that anti-discrimination law can kind of lead to a fear that if you start collecting demographic data, you might end up just being liable for what you find. And finally, kind of unsurprisingly, if organizational priorities actually conflict with the goals of algorithmic fairness, it can just kind of stop efforts to collect data, demographic data in their tracks. And so moving to the issues faced by practitioners more directly, these were some of the concerns that we saw crop up. And so firstly, when it is available, self-reported demographic data is often sparse, incomplete, or for other reasons, kind of just questionable. And interestingly, many of the practitioners that we talked to kind of actually saw this as being somewhat justified. There's kind of not too much reason for people to respond reliably. And secondly, seeing as self-reported data is kind of hard to come by, inferring these attributes instead is kind of often seen as the second best option. But interestingly, most of the practitioners that we spoke to kind of expressed this explicit unease or outright opposition to this approach, given kind of the risk around misrepresentation and the general kind of ickiness of inferring people's sensitive attributes. And interestingly, another common issue that we heard about was this question of whether the practitioners themselves should be the ones deciding kind of which categories to use in these fairness analyses, and how these categories should be defined. And this is a very big topic that we will come back to later in the day, because yeah, it's a big one. And then finally, we also had a number of practitioners express concerns kind of on a deeper level kind of such as like whether their organization's relationship with their data subjects would kind of like actually even allow for the responsible collection and use of this data. And similarly, kind of whether collecting that data would actually lead to the change that they were kind of striving for. And like the concerns here were either kind of because of, there's the lack of clear mitigation strategies once you actually detect issues, but also kind of just a concern that there might not be a buy-in from leadership. And so moving forward, really kind of what this work showed us, this initial stage of the work, is that by requiring access to demographic data, algorithmic fairness strategies really do kind of implicate the social, ethical, legal, and political challenges behind these much broader topics of categorization and sensitive data collection. And so if we want fairness efforts to kind of be truly beneficial in this space, we think it's important that we start to try to understand these stakes. And luckily, many amazing thinkers from many other disciplines have confronted these questions before. And so here is a very rough sketch of some higher level risk around the collection and use of demographic data. And as well, kind of below, we've just listed a few different fields, areas of study that might help us kind of better understand them. And I think it's important to note as well that these lines that we've drawn are clearly not distinct. I think that's okay. All of these categories are interrelated, but by kind of doing this disambiguation gives us some sense of kind of just where to start for understanding these stakes. And so to start, we have the first set of concerns that most people think about when they hear phrases such as sensitive data. And so these are issues around privacy and consensual data collection. And one thing that's important to consider in this regard, however, is that privacy is not always limited to individuals, especially when thinking about demographics. When data is collected from part of a group, that data can be generalized or otherwise used in ways that affect the community as a whole. And so as we're thinking about the kind of data risks on the privacy side, we think it's important to kind of be thinking in a group privacy sense as well. And secondly, there are many risks surrounding the misrepresentation of individuals and groups when information about demographics is collected. And so on the individual level, I think, being misgendered or otherwise misrepresented in a data-driven system can have mental, emotional, and even materially kind of deleterious effects. And on a broader scale, I think data about communities can actually be mobilized against those communities in insidious ways. And so most commonly, I think part of what we see is this, we see this as the effects of kind of racism being repackaged as effects of race in causal analyses. And I think this kind of thing kind of really calls into question the whole point of why we're actually collecting racial data in the first place. And then thirdly, there's this process of lumping groups of people into various categories and buckets. And it's, kind of extremely normalized, yet still very fraught. And, as I said before, I will let kind of our second set of speakers cover this in more detail, but there's a lot to go into there. And finally, it matters immensely kind of what the actual goal of demographic data collection is, and kind of like how it's expected that data will be mobilized, kind of how, I think as it comes up in the fact community, right, like kind of how fairness is understood, and what we're striving for when we're working towards fairness. And this also kind of brings up questions of how the collection process is carried out in practice, and in turn, just kind of this broader question of how the data is actually used to shift power. And so this is the set of issues that our first set of speakers will actually kind of explore and touch on. And just as a final note on this slide, I should also just say that these areas of studies, such as Indigenous data sovereignty and Black studies, have actually kind of explored each of these risks in detail. And so yeah, don't read too much into where each of these categories or areas of study fell. And then, yeah, and so just to kind of briefly reiterate, our talk today will cover first the kind of context and relations component of these risks around demographic data. And then our second set of talks will look more at the categorization and classification issues. And yeah, so I think, this is a participatory workshop. And so we have our talks, we have our Q&A sessions, but we also have a number of activities. And this is really where we're going to try to get to the meat of the title of, kind of doing this work of contesting and reimagining the infrastructures around demographic data. And we think this is important to do because these risks around demographic data are really realized through the infrastructures that algorithmic fairness relies on when deployed in practice. And I think this is a great opportunity for us all to kind of consider our role just in keeping those infrastructures going or possibly changing them. And it's also a really great opportunity to start building community around a very, very hard problem and a very expansive problem. So